the United States needed to target those British strongholds on the St. Lawrence River if they were going to conquer Canada.
Mhm.
And my own opinion was, and still is, that they were incapable of
Mhm.
achieving those objectives. And that means the War of 1812 for the United States was unwinnable.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Stories of 1812 podcast. This is a series in which we interview writers, authors, scholars about the individual characters that fought and participated in the War of 1812. And today we have a very special guest with us, right from the cornfields of Nebraska. He made it all the way here to Niagara, and his name is Don Hickey. Don is an award winning author and historian. He's been called the Dean of 1812 Scholarship by the New Yorker, and he has written uh, at least a dozen books, including the highly acclaimed The War of 1812, A Forgotten Conflict. He's also done extensive consulting in that area for historical parks, museums, and government agencies. And Don, a very warm welcome to Canada and to Niagara.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here, Marinus.
Well, that's great. We're going to talk today. There's many things we could talk about, but today we're going to talk about your book, which is entitled Tecumseh's War, the Epic Conflict for the Heart of America. And I think this is it your latest book?
Yes,
Yeah.
published in the fall of 2023. It's nearly 2 years old now.
Okay. And I know you've written other books, and maybe as we talk, you can make the linkage. I mean, your first book was on the War of 1812 itself, and that's a seminal work. It came out again in a bicentennial edition. Was this kind of a springboard from that work? I mean, did that earlier work lead to this work?
Well, in a way, it did. I had written a short book on Jackson at New Orleans,
Mm.
and that sort of marked the end of this period of Anglo American Indian conflict. And I thought, well, what if I did a book on the opening round, which would have been the Battle of Tippecanoe in November of 1811? And then I have bookends to
Yeah,
this period of warfare.
yeah.
And I started that book, and books have a way of sometimes taking on a life of their own. And it just kind of expanded. And I realized what we really needed was not another book on Tippecanoe, but a book that moved Tecumseh's War to center stage instead of just treating it as an aspect of the War of 1812, which is entirely appropriate. Let's move it to center stage. It had a different chronology, different causes, a different outcome and legacy. And so I thought this really deserves its separate treatment. And so ultimately what I did in developing this book was move that war to center stage and focus on that conflict.
Okay. Well, we're going to get to that in a moment, but I think the first question that a lot of people are asking is who was Tecumseh? So I think we have to talk a little bit about Tecumseh. I think somewhere in your book you say he was the last, that Tecumseh's War was the last great war between the American natives, the American Indians, and the United States in the Old West. And he was the leader of a confederacy, I believe, against uh, the American government, the American forces, and he tried to build. I'm just doing an overview. He tried to build a confederacy uniting the various tribes in the U.S. against the American government and against the American forces.
Yes, his vision, and it was pretty ambitious, was to build a Native American confederacy to resist U.S. expansion. And it would include all the tribes between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes in the north and the Gulf of America or Mexico in the south. And it turned out it really couldn't be done. There were just too
Mhm.
many problems. The Indians communicating with one another, being traditional enemies, and many had made their peace with the United States. So it was probably an unrealistic vision, but that's what he hoped to do: is
Mhm.
forge a confederacy to resist American expansion. And the Tecumseh's War really began with the Battle of Tippecanoe on November 7th, 1811. And 7 months later, on June 18th, 1815, when the United States declared war against Great Britain, really over maritime issues, but using an invasion of Canada and hopefully the conquest of Canada to get have a means of pressuring the British to make concessions on the maritime issues. Tecumseh realized that he really needed to forge a full-fledged alliance with Great Britain to wage this war, his war against the United States.
Why should we? So, a lot of people know the title of the War of 1812. And then, oh, Tecumseh's War. Why should we consider it as different, as separate?
Well, it's entirely proper to fold Tecumseh's War into the War of 1812, and that's what virtually all scholars did, and I did in my work on the War of 1812. But I think it also because it begins 8 months, 7 months before the War of 1812. It lasts for the last peace treaty between the United States and the Indians was 1817, which was nearly 3 years after the end of the War of 1812 in February of 1815. So, in order to get the full story of Tecumseh's War, you really got to separate it from the War of 1812, or you'll ignore aspects of it.
Well, you had different principal antagonists, didn't you? And the causes were different.
Causes were certainly different.
Yeah.
The Confederacy was designed to resist American expansion, mainly in the Old Northwest. That's where he got his allies. The War of 1812 was fought over maritime issues, and most of the fighting was on the northern frontier with Canada. So you've got kind of a different way. You've got different objectives and different theaters of operation. The Old Northwest, which is the main theater of operation for Tecumseh's War, is actually a relatively minor one in the War of 1812 because the United States is never going to win that war
Mhm.
by conquering that part of Upper Canada.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's just too remote, too far removed from the centers of population and power further east, namely Montreal
Mhm.
and Quebec.
Mhm.
The United States needed to target those British strongholds on the St. Lawrence River if they were going to conquer Canada.
Mhm.
And my own opinion was, and still is, that they were incapable of
Mhm.
achieving those objectives. And that means the War of 1812 for the United States was unwinnable.
Mhm.
And my further conclusion is you don't want to get involved in any war that is not winnable.
Yeah, yeah. So we will have people that, are taking notes. And one of the things they might be noting down is the two time frames. So the war of, for both respective wars. So the War of 1812, June 18th, 1812 to February 17th, when Madison signed the peace treaty. What a what's the comparable time frame for Tecumseh's War?
Well, if you look at it would be November
Mhm.
7th, 1811. Tippecanoe marks the beginning of Tecumseh's War. The end is the fighting is effectively over. It's a little bit of skirmishing as late as late 1815. I think it's the governor of Indiana who announces in his December address to his people that the war is finally over. But you actually have a battle fought in the War of 1812 in June of 1815 in the Pacific. Um, a small naval battle because at least the Americans had gotten word that the war was over. The
Mhm.
British had, but they
Mhm.
couldn't convince the Americans, and so
Yeah.
there was this broadside
Mhm.
exchange of fire, the American ships. I think they compelled the British ship to surrender, an armed East India ship. In any case, that's effectively the last battle of the War of 1812, and it's some months after the war is effectively over. Last battle of Tecumseh's War, Well, probably a skirmish in late 1815, maybe 4 or 5 months after that.
Mhm. Now, the battle, what they were fighting for were the lands of the Old Northwest. Now, you had American settlers that coveted those lands. They were rich and fertile, great for agriculture, but the native groups used those as hunting grounds. And gradually, and obviously, you're more the expert than me, from considering I'm north of the border. But there was encroachment on those lands. Those lands were ceded by various native groups, and that's what you know ired, uh, irked Tecumseh and his followers, and that's what led to a lot of these conflicts.
Yeah, there was a very powerful westward movement, and nobody, no government in the United States could get out in front of that. They
Mm,
couldn't stop it. The best they could hope to do was minimize the violence.
mhm,
When they tried to break up squatter settlements that were beyond the treaty line in the 1790s, they even burned their cabins. And then the army left and the squatters went back and rebuilt them. So, about the most any administration could hope to do was to somehow get out in front of this and minimize the violence. Now, Jefferson's plan, he was president from 1801 to 1809, and his hammer in the West was William Henry Harrison. And he told Harrison, you get all the possible land you can through treaties. And ultimately, there were 15 signed, largely under Harrison's management between 1803 and 1809. And it was those treaties which surrendered about 25% of the Old Northwest to the United States that brought on Tecumseh's War, because nobody could say that those would be the last of the treaties.
mm, mm. So the conflict continues. Now, Tecumseh himself uh, was born in 1769,
He was 68, maybe.
1768,
Yeah.
and he was born in Ohio. He had early exposure to conflict. I think his father was killed in battle. He was mentored by his brother. His brother was also killed in battle. So early exposure and involvement in that conflict. And as he grew up, he was subject to a number of influences. One of the great native leaders at the time was Joseph Brant of the Mohawk, and I think he was. I don't really have the place, but in Ohio, there was a Grand Council where Joseph Brant talked about the fact that the natives must unite to keep their lands, and that um, there was an unspoken truth, if you like, that the native lands were held in common by all the tribes. So there, I guess you had the core, the kernel of the Indian resistance, or the ideology for it.
Yeah, Brand was the one who set forth that idea. If all the Indian lands are held in common, and none can be sold without the consent of all, then none will be sold. And Tecumseh embraced that doctrine, and he tried to enforce it, and insisted to the United States in his meetings with Harrison. There were several in which he said, no land can be sold without the permission of all the tribes. The United States found that view anathema because they wanted to divide and conquer and insisted that they could not agree to that proposition. And so they didn't. But that was sort of the doctrine that Tecumseh embraced in the hope of preserving Indian lands from further cession treaties.
Well, he wasn't at the head of the resistance, but he took part and was involved in a number of conflicts and battles before, if you like, his ascendancy. And one of those was at the Battle of Timbers. And that, maybe you could tell us a little bit about that. What I'm trying to get across is this resistance by native groups, by indigenous groups. This didn't happen all at once under him, right? This was
No.
a growing movement.
There was a long story of
Yeah.
Native American resistance to American and before that British expansion. You had Pontiac's War in the 1760s. Heck, you can go back to the 17th century, and you have Opechancanought's War against the Virginians. But it was Little Turtle's War, 1790 to 95, also called the Northwest Indian War or George Washington's Indian War, which Tecumseh participated in. The culminating battle, the Battle of Fallen Timbers,
Timbers.
was in 1794, and the Indians were defeated. And the British didn't give them any help. They had a fort nearby, and they slammed the doors of that fort, the gates.
Fort Miami.
Yes, or
Yeah.
Miami's. There may be
Yeah.
an S on it.
Okay.
Would not allow the Indians fleeing from the Americans sanctuary there because they feared it would precipitate an Anglo-American war. And Tecumseh was really fed up, not only with the defeat, but the failure of the British to support the Indians. They had abandoned them in 1783 in the peace treaty.
Peace treaty. Yeah.
The Indians weren't even consulted. The entire West was awarded to the United States. They were abandoned essentially in the Jay Treaty of 1794 when the United States and Great Britain worked out some of their common differences. And the British thereafter reduced the Indian Department and really let their sort of quasi alliance with the Indians fall into abeyance. They resumed that alliance or that connection after the Chesapeake affair threatened an Anglo American war in 1807. And they had, so they'd abandoned the Indians in 1783, 1794, and 95 when the Treaty of Greenville ended Tecumseh's War, and then again in 1815 after the War of 1812.
So we're kind of how would I say this? We're following developments, and before his ascendancy, which would have been later, several other things happened that led to the, if you like, the coalescence of a movement under him, and one of those was the foundation of a religious movement. Now he had a brother who I'm really loath to pronounce his name. He was his younger brother, and apparently he had a vision. Had a religious conversion, and he founded a religious movement which urged the, if you like, the going back by natives to their traditional ways. And if that may have you could consider that, an important milestone because it led later to the coalition under him. Um, can you tell us a little bit about that? What was attractive for natives in that movement that was founded?
This is a recurring theme in Native American history, an Indian revitalization movement that'll reverse history and will restore sort of their way of life before the white man threatened it. Now, at the end of Little Turtle's War in 1795, Tecumseh was so fed up, not only with the Americans, but also the British, that he led a small band of followers into Indiana on the White River, including his brother. And his brother was a no account, an alcoholic who couldn't even hunt well enough to supply his own family, so others had to help out. But he had this vision in 1805. He was sitting around a campfire at night with his wife and probably his children, and he reached for, he had a stick and he reached to light it in the flame so he could light his pipe, and he collapsed. And the people around him looked at him and thought he wasn't breathing, thought he was dead, and some of them left to arrange for his burial. And then he recovered and claimed that he had had a vision that he visited with the Great Spirit in the sky, and he had conversed with him and been told if the Indians would give up some of their white ways and return to their traditional ways, uh, the earth would be overturned on the white people, and the Indians again would dominate the landscape. And this was a very attractive vision to a lot of Indian individual tribes and bands, and because it offered a way out of this terrible situation they're in, where their lands were being taken. Many were consumed by
Mhm.
alcohol. They couldn't find game, and so they were threatened with starvation. Many Native American tribes were in a real crisis, and this offered a way out. And so uh, the Lilla Withaka,
Mhm.
uh, the Tecumseh's brother, gave up alcohol and
Mhm.
started preaching this vision and became known as the Shawnee prophet, or simply the prophet in the way I would put it. Before he had this conversion, there were many prophets in Indian country. After his vision, there was only one.
Well, they were able to do something with it, which is the next thing, is they founded maybe not a religious community, but a community based on these principles called Prophetstown, right? And they
Yes.
gathered various tribes and various different groupings together.
Well, initially they established
Yeah.
Lily Ithaquana took on a
Mhm.
new name, Tenskwatawa,
Okay.
which means open door. He was
Open
opening the door to
doors.
a new way of life.
Yeah.
They initially established a community in Greenville to be near the Americans who were receiving annuities, hoping to attract them to the cause. Then they moved it west to Prophetstown on the Wabash Tippecanoe River. And that became the center of this new Indian revitalization movement, and essentially the center for resistance to American expansion.
Well, it was working, right? And they tried to coexist peacefully. But then William Henry Harrison in 1809 negotiated the Treaty of Fort Wayne, which ceded huge parts, as I understand it, of Illinois and Indiana. And that was a spark, I think, that didn't sit well
There were actually
with
four
Tecumseh.
treaties that
Hmm.
collectively are called the Treaty of
Treaty of
Fort
Fort
Wayne.
Wayne.
And that was, in a way, the last straw.
Hmm.
And the reason it was so threatening was not simply these penetrated so deep into what was traditionally Indian country,
Hmm.
but nobody could say this was the last treaty.
Mm.
And even Harrison couldn't say.
Yeah.
And he was interested in acquiring still more land, and he tried after those treaties. But others said, no, no, I think we've gone about far enough. But that really, I suppose, was the spark that precipitated the armed resistance. Although
Mm.
Tecumseh had been working on building
Mhm.
a Native American confederation, essentially superimposing a military and political alliance on the religious movement that his brother had launched.
And then he went down south to try and recruit. And he let slip, as I understand it, to Harrison that he would not be in Prophetstown. And Harrison took advantage of that.
Yes, and I
Yeah.
think it was a blunder. It wasn't a slip.
Oh,
He told
okay.
Harrison, he said, look, I'm
Yeah.
going down south. He was going to try to recruit Southern allies, and he couldn't because those Americans or those Indians were too Americanized. And some of them were traditional enemies of the Northwestern Indians. Some of them actually worked with as scouts with Anthony Wayne in the Fallen Timbers campaign
Mhm.
against the Northwestern Indians. So he didn't have much luck down there. But he told Harrison, he said, "Look, I'm going to be down south for the next several months, but when I return in the spring, we can talk again."
Mhm.
And I don't
This
think
was
he
at Vincennes where he'd had those meetings with
Yes,
Harrison.
he had
Yeah.
2 meetings with Harrison. The
Yeah.
first
Yeah.
very nearly led to bloodshed,
Mm.
although they averted it. The second, it was clear there was going to be no solution to this problem,
Mhm.
and Harrison was hot to march on Prophet Sound and break up this center of Indian resistance. He'd
Mhm.
been pressuring the War Department to let him make a demonstration against Prophetstown, and when he learned from Tecumseh that he was going to be gone, he thought, well, this is a great opportunity. The War Department reluctantly said, okay, you can take a force up there and break it up. And he did.
Right, because Harrison had to get permission. I think he'd been asking, but he had to
Oh,
get
yes,
permission, didn't he, from the administration?
absolutely.
Yeah,
He'd been
yeah,
pressing the
yeah.
administration for authority to launch this campaign. And it might or might not lead to a military engagement. But he was determined to break up the center of resistance. And the interesting thing about it is there were Indian raids on settlements further west, and Harrison knew
Mm.
that Tecumseh the Prophet really didn't control those militants in the west in Illinois, but he sort of maintained the fiction that they did, and that's why he needed to make some kind of demonstration on Vincent, or excuse me, on Prophetstown.
Now, at Prophetstown, I think the natives attacked first, right? But they were routed by Harrison, and then Harrison proceeded to burn down Prophetstown.
Yes.
Yeah.
He met with several of the Indian leaders the
Mm.
night before,
Before.
and they agreed to have a council the next day. And so he made camp that night,
Mhm.
anticipating that they would, work something out the next day. But he didn't build any breastworks, which he did on his march up there, and he allowed large fires in his camp to keep the Americans warm so they'd be fresh the next day. And the Indians decided to attack, and so they began to gather after midnight, close enough to launch an attack the next morning, even though Tecumseh had very
He's good.
strongly told his brother, do not attack
Yeah, we're
Tecumseh's
not
force.
ready.
We're
Yeah,
not ready.
ready.
I'm
Yeah,
still building our Confederacy.
yeah.
And later, when he returned and found
He was pretty mad.
he
Yeah,
was absolutely furious.
yeah, yeah. So I think it was around this point where Tecumseh realized that he needed an alliance with the British, not that he didn't have one, and he went to Amherstburg. And go ahead, sorry.
He did.
Yeah.
Now, just to pick up on your point,
Mm,
Harrison's force at um, Prophetstown did ultimately prevail. The Indians ran out of ammo. They
mm,
hadn't overrun his force, and so they decamped. And he did burn Prophetstown and all the food that he couldn't carry away. And I think it's important to
mm,
point out that this kind of scorched earth policy became, as it had been in earlier wars,
mhm.
a very effective way of waging war against the native
But they came
forces.
back, didn't they, to Prophetstown?
They did,
There was another settlement there
and they
afterwards.
later
Yeah,
occupied it.
yeah.
And the next time they were attacked, they sensibly simply withdrew.
Mm.
And then when the Americans left because they hadn't encountered them, they were able to move back into Prophetstown. But that scorched earth policy was extremely effective against the Indians. They were deprived of food and shelter, especially in the winter, and
Mm.
probably more Indians perished from exposure, disease, and starvation in Tecumseh's war than from any losses in battles with the United States.
So Tecumseh goes to Amherstburg, which is near present-day Windsor, across the river from Detroit, and he starts helping. I think in the summer, in June, he starts helping the British, and he starts engaging in skirmishes and battles in and around that area, particularly when Hull, who'd brought a force up to Fort Detroit, crossed the Canadian. I think it was in July,
Hmm.
crossed the border, and invaded Canada.
Well, he needed the British to supply him with food
Mm.
and ammunition and other necessities, but he tried to sort of keep him at arm's length until the United States declared war on Great Britain. And that, I think,
That changed everything.
yeah,
Yeah,
he
yeah.
realized I've got no choice here. I've got to forge essentially a full-fledged alliance with the British. The British needed the Indians because they needed bodies who could wage war, and the Indians needed the British because they needed supplies.
And up here north of the border, this is the one episode we're very familiar with, when Brock comes in August of 1812 and joins forces with Tecumseh to attack the Battle of Detroit, which was a bloodless battle, but nonetheless, they joined forces
They did,
and they
and
and Hull surrendered.
yes,
Yeah,
Hull was.
yeah.
The problem with the United States was they put these relics from the Revolution in charge of their military forces, and none of them had a taste for battle,
Mm.
and some of them didn't even have a taste for campaigning. They would hope to sit in some headquarters miles away from any action and just let their subordinates handle the heavy, the nasty business of waging a campaign. Hull had suffered a stroke and I think, a heart attack, and he'd really lost his nerve.
Mm.
And Brock very shrewdly essentially laid siege to the fort, and I would say he played the Indian card. He demanded that Hull surrender his forces. He says, if you don't, we will attack, and I will not be
You
able to control my.
control the natives that are with me. And
Yes,
yeah,
and
yeah,
that meant there would be a massacre.
yeah.
And Hull's own family was there. What do I do with my family? What do I do with the women and children?
Mm.
And so the strategy to play the Indian card was effective, and Hull surrendered his entire force, including the forces, some that were still in Ohio that weren't even up on the Detroit River.
So Brock heads back to Niagara. But then we still have cooperation between the leader of the British forces, Proctor, and Tecumseh's forces. And there was at least one major battle, um, I think in early 1813, uh, called Frenchtown.
Yes, the Anglo-Indian force retained the initiative
Mm.
after Hull's surrender, and they defeated an American force at Frenchtown in January of 1815. There was an Indian massacre the next day. Not clear if it's Tecumseh's forces. He's not even there. He's out recruiting elsewhere during
Well,
this
Proctor had to
campaign.
leave the wounded. That was part of the issue, and they were under the, if you like, supervision um, of largely natives, were they not?
Well,
Yeah,
there were a few surgeons there,
yeah,
and those who couldn't walk that he could take with as prisoners of war were left there,
mm,
and some Indians showed up the next day and essentially killed some 30 or so.
yeah. And I think in a previous conversation we you mentioned that, but it was much more exaggerated than that. I mean, I think at Malden, not at Malden, but at the Battle of Moravia Town, they were yelling, "Remember the Raisin,"
Oh
in
yes,
reference to the
yes.
River Raisin. Why was there so much rage about the
Well,
results
this
of the
was known
battle?
as
Yeah,
the River Raisin. Excuse me, the River Raisin massacre.
massacre. Yeah.
And eyewitness observers got their reports published in Washington, and they were carried in newspapers all over the country. And so when the United States launched its counteroffensive, and that occurred only after Perry had defeated the British squadron on
Mhm.
Lake Erie, thus enabling the United States to control the lake and move troops across the lake and into Upper Canada.
Yeah.
Um, the as a this large force, Harrison's force, about 3,000 strong, threatened maybe 1,000 British troops and Tecumseh's forces about 75 miles east of the Detroit River.
Yeah.
And that was the Battle of the Thames. And the Americans overran the British force, and their battle cry was "Remember the Raisin."
Yeah, you're keeping up a good pace, a better pace than me, because I was going to stop for a moment and mention Fort Meigs, because in the calendar, Tecumseh still working with the British, and this is like May of 1813,
Yeah.
and Fort Meigs again. I think were there two attempts to siege the fort. One of the memorable incidents is, which is cited by some Tecumseh biographers, is how Tecumseh intervened to save the lives of his fellow natives, fellow Indians that were being tortured and or um,
Indians and whites. Um,
and Indian
the
whites.
high
Okay,
water mark of the Anglo-Indian alliance
yeah,
was the Battle of Frenchtown
yeah,
in January of 1813. Now, thereafter, the Anglo-Indian forces make two assaults on Fort Meigs. One real assault, which fails. A second is sort of a threat of an assault, and nothing really happens there except then they threaten nearby Fort Stevenson and get repelled. The Indians don't even take part in that. They don't like frontal assaults on forts, but Proctor's forces really take a beating there.
Mhm.
And I would say that you can see that the tide is beginning to turn, and it really turns with Perry's great victory in
Yes, at Put
September.
in Bay on Lake
Yeah.
Erie. And then we get this infamous conversation between Proctor and I think even the Indian agent for the British, William Dixon. And they're dealing with a Tecumseh who does not want to retreat and who wants to stay and fight. But eventually, I think he's convinced, isn't he, by Proctor
Well,
to retreat.
he he may have been convinced. He
Yeah.
wanted to. He said, "I want my to bury my bones here,
Yes. Yeah.
if necessary," resisting the American invasion that was expected across the Detroit River. But they kind of convince him that he's going to be approached from the rear because the Americans now control the lake and they'll be able to control some of the other waterways. And so the British promised to make a
A
stand.
stand
It
at
turned
Chatham.
but yeah, it turns
Yeah.
out to be quite a bit further west
Yeah.
than he had hoped for, and he actually fought a little engagement
Mm,
at Chatham before
mm.
marching further west and taking a position north of the British, who were perpendicular to the Thames
So it
River.
was at a place called Moravia Town. And have you been to the site? I have.
Yes.
Yes. And you can't really go, it's swampy. You can't really go in
Yeah.
there, but it really is special. They've done it up very nicely, I
Yeah.
thought, when I was there about a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Well, when I was there a long time ago, they'd done virtually nothing.
Oh,
If
okay.
this was not a battle that the British or wanted to remember, and I'm not sure the Indians did. They have done quite a bit since then, as I understand it. But the Americans launched a frontal mounted assault Kentucky riflemen against the British and just blew right through their lines. And that part of the battle was over in 5 or 10 minutes.
I thought the British, wasn't it the British lines that collapsed first and then they fled?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, and they
Yeah.
fled or surrendered, and 15 minutes later, the attack was made on the Indians, and the American force to the north couldn't blow through the Indian lines because
Mm,
it was swampy.
mm,
They were going to have to dismount,
yeah.
and they had a little group of 20 men, known as the Forlorn Hope. Their job was to initiate the charge, draw enemy fire. So you'd see from the black powder puffs where the enemy was, they would have to reload, and the men behind you presumably would be able to
The
overrun
front
them.
line takes the casualties,
Yeah,
and then the secondary line. Richard Johnson, I think, was
yeah.
the,
Richard,
and his brother or
yeah.
something, right?
Well,
Yeah,
James Johnson headed the force that overran the British.
yeah.
Um, Richard Johnson, which was actually his superior in charge of the entire 1,000-man Kentucky mounted force, headed the 500 that were going to attack Tecumseh. But what happened was Johnson, being a real prince of a fellow, he volunteered to be part of the Forlorn Hope, the 20 who were going to attack. He was shot. I think he sustained 4 wounds, his horse 7 wounds. But
But he had two pistols that were
he did.
loaded.
And when he was approached by Tecumseh, we think Tecumseh, to finish him off, he pulled out one of his pistols, shot this Indian, apparently a chief, apparently Tecumseh, in the chest and killed him, and was credited with killing Tecumseh. And eventually, the Indians gave up, faded into the wilderness, and the Battle of the Thames was over. The Americans prevailed.
Now, what do we think happened with Tecumseh's body? And maybe we should bring in our really good colleague, Guy St. Denis, who's written a book called Tecumseh's Bones. And I think he concluded that because there have been many stories, that his bones were dug up and taken to Walpole Island, for example, but we think he was buried, or Guy thinks he was buried on the battlefield.
Yes, and I
Yeah,
think that's probably correct.
yeah.
They would dig long trenches and throw the bodies in, and I think his was probably one of the Indian bodies that was tossed into a trench. You only got a separate or a little, maybe a special burial if you were an officer. And Indians, I think they were all dumped in trenches along with any British or American privates who
Yeah, they
perished.
didn't really have, how would I say that, the respect that they do today for bodies. I mean, even at Lundy's Lane, they had a huge fire.
Yeah.
So, what are we to think today about Tecumseh? I mean, he has such a tremendous legacy. I know he has a legacy in Canada. There's a town called Tecumseh near Windsor. Um, isn't there a statue of him at the U.S. Naval Academy
Well,
or something?
it's
Yeah,
said to be him, and they
yeah.
treated it as it's him, but it's after a Delaware Indian who was essentially a pacifist
Mm,
and one of William Penn's buddies. But the midshipmen there choose to think it's Tecumseh because he was so much more so warlike. But Tecumseh does well in the United States because he's considered the noble savage who
mm,
didn't believe in torture,
mm.
killing prisoners of war, the noble savage who resisted as long as he could and gave his life in the defense of Canada.
Indeed,
So
indeed. Yeah.
there's a community in my own town, in my own state,
Mm,
Nebraska, that's
mm.
named after him, Tecumseh, Nebraska.
Well, isn't this sort of typical about, heroes, it's in their death that that they're remembered and that their legacy grows.
And that their
Yeah.
enemies can show the greatest respect for them because they're
Yes.
no longer a threat.
Yeah.
And in fact, my take is that Tecumseh's War represents the last chance that Native Americans had because of the British alliance to affect the future of North America.
Indeed.
And they were defeated, and so they would not have another chance because they'd never have another
Yeah.
ally like the British.
Well, I think there's a lot more that we could say about Tecumseh, but unfortunately, we have to leave it here. Once again, if you would like to follow up on Don Hickey's work, I think you have a website,
I do.
Hickey History.
Yes,
Yeah,
hickeyhistory.com.
history.com. And you can find all about this book and some of his previous books. Thank you for joining us today on the Stories of 1812 podcast. Our website is storiesof1812.com. And we're going to put in some show notes about your work, Dawn, and your website. Thank you for joining us. Once again, Jim Valen, our technical guru, will make sure that all of this can happen. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next time.